There's a wallet.
He's completely naked wherever he's at.
To get a 2 a.m. phone call from a highway patrolman, that changes your life forever.
His family is desperate for answers.
I was the only one looking for Jason.
And the car ran off the road right around this curve.
Found his wrecked car.
God, please be with him.
This episode of Disappeared retraces Jason's last known steps.
Why did he miss that turn? Did something nefarious happen to him?
It really is two separate questions. What happened to Jason? Where is Jason?
Words can't describe that living hell. Thinking, is he lying in some shallow grave somewhere? That's all you can think about.
The more people who know Jason's story, the greater the chance of bringing him home. Share on social media. Get the word out. Help find him. Have you seen Jason Landry?
I'm Jason Landry's father. Every college student is different, but Jason has always been, he's always been strong-willed. He's always been courageous. He just would always strike out on an adventure. He would do anything. He was always incredibly optimistic. He always figured everything would be okay in the end. Lisa and I have been married 31 years. We have 3 kids. Jason's our youngest. My wife's a musician. I can't carry a tune in a bucket, but he's always wanted to play any instrument. He's always loved it. Growing up in a church family isn't a normal family. Being a preacher's kid is difficult. I think there's just this pressure to be perfect. Going to church is not really optional when you're a preacher's kid, and that's unusual in this day and age. This was his first semester at Texas State. Finals were just wrapping up, and he was coming back for Christmas. So, you know, kind of looking forward to the week and all the different things you've got going on in life.
My name is Jack Frank. I've known Jason Landry since childhood, and he was also my next door neighbor here in college. Jason's game plan was to go home and then just be home for winter break. He said, I'm gonna hit the road back home, and I sent him a text asking him to get some sleep before he hit the road, and he sent me a text saying that I'm all good, I appreciate you looking out. And that was the last I got to hear from him.
My name is Jeff Ferry. I'm a captain of the Criminal Investigation Division of the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office. December 13th, 2020 was a Sunday night. A volunteer firefighter is driving down Salt Flat Road, which is this county road in Luling, and he encounters a vehicle with its driver's side against a tree line, a fence line.
Got some driver's side damage.
Headlights are on, sees that it's unoccupied.
Apparently, the driver was able to kick out the window in the back.
The volunteer calls the Caldwell County Dispatch. In our county, Texas Highway Patrol works all motor vehicle collisions. And so a Texas Highway Patrol trooper ends up responding about an hour later. He kind of drove up and down the road looking for the driver of this vehicle, making sure there's nobody who's hurt, and maybe he wandered off from the car and now he's laying in a ditch and he needs medical aid. We have to find him, especially because temperatures are dropping. It's cold. We've got a pretty significant weather event blowing in that night. But he doesn't find anybody. So Highway Patrol shows up at that accident scene.
There's where his shorts and underwear are.
He does encounter some clothes, which is very unusual. The clothes are about 900 feet to the south, going towards Luling from the collision scene.
He's completely naked wherever he's at.
Those articles of clothes are strewn about the roadway in sequence consistent with voluntarily disrobing. Then he finds the backpack.
Oh, there's a wallet.
At this point, our deputy arrives at the vehicle collision scene.
White male. Probably a college kid. Oh, my goodness.
Yep.
Make a note, approximately 10 marijuana blunts located inside a prescription bottle.
Certainly the narcotics we think played a factor. There was no indication there had been a loss of life as a result of that collision. All the evidence was that this was an intoxicated person, college kid out of Texas State, goofing off and had a collision. Why does he take his clothes off? I don't know.
Last name Landry, first name Jason.
And our trooper radios the driver's license number in, then ends up calling Mr. Landry and Mrs. Landry, who are the registered owners of the vehicle that's left abandoned.
Hello?
Mrs. Landry?
Yeah?
My name is Trooper Flores with the Texas Highway Patrol.
Okay.
The reason I'm calling is I'm currently at a crash scene involving a 2003 Nissan Altima golden color.
Okay.
I suspect Jason may have been driving this vehicle.
Oh my gosh, okay.
To get a 2 a.m. phone call and be a highway patrolman on the other end of the line is just, well, you just can't imagine it. That changes your life forever.
How bad was the car?
He crashed into some trees and a private fence.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Have you been in contact with him this evening?
I have not.
Are you able to find his phone?
No.
So, should I head? What should we do?
Well,
Then pray.
Yeah, we're in Houston.
no, I understand. I'll be back in touch with you momentarily, okay?
I wouldn't say they were nonchalant, but they found his wrecked car and they were looking for him. And really kind of that was about it. I don't know how long I waited before I left, but it wasn't too long. Then I hit the road. I'm driving to Luling from Houston, and I was just gonna help search and do whatever it needed to be to find my son. Frankly, I was driving along thinking at any minute, I'm gonna see Jason just walking along the road, and I'd get to choke him and hug him at the same time. But there's nothing on this dark highway. I'm almost to Luling, and I figure there are people searching. I figure there are sirens, there's cops walking around with spotlights on. There's nothing out there. My wife, Lisa, calls me and says, they towed the car. I'm like, can you call the highway patrolman and get the exact location? She called the highway patrolman and she woke him up because he had gone home and gone to bed. So she gave me the exact location off of Salt Flat Road. When I found the accident site.
These are the track marks, and you can go down here, and you can see where the car went off. You can see the wheels and hit down here by this tree and fence.
And that's when I found his clothes.
See, those are 2 pairs of socks, shorts.
Mr. Landry sees socks, and they're kind of goofy socks, and he knows immediately, those are my sons.
I was a lawyer. I'm not stupid. I know what evidence could be, but they don't work the scene. That's my personal opinion. They don't do what everyone has seen that they do at an accident site. Put the tape up, measure the tire tracks, pick up the evidence that literally is laying in front of you. But I don't know why they don't pick up his clothes.
I'm about 20 feet ahead. This is his flip-flops. This is his T-shirt.
Thankfully, Mr. Landry documents that prior to picking him up. He takes video of all that.
This is his toiletry bag. And the car ran off the road right around this curve. So this is, maybe a football field, maybe a little bit more, where I found his clothes lying in the road.
This still pisses me off, to be honest. It's your job to do the most basic thing. But from the very beginning, highway patrolman thought this was nothing other than a one-car accident with some college student who smoked pot, and he's just wandering around out in the woods. Well, if you believe that that's true in 30-degree weather with 20-knot winds, and literally there's a full set of clothes lying on the road, you at least go find the lost person, wrap a blanket around them, give them some hot soup, and then sort out the details as to what happened. But I was the only one looking for Jason. I had to find my phone for Jason so I could see that his phone was at the tow lot where the highway patrolman said the car was towed.
What the heck happened back here?
When I found his wrecked car, it's just kind of chaos in a sense of your emotions.
God, please be with him.
I knew his phone was in there. It had slid down kind of between the seat and the armrest. I had to go from the back seat kind of behind it, and I was able to get it. Not that I can unlock it, it's just I had his phone.
There's no evidence of where Jason is, and so there's nobody looking for Jason. And so Mr. Landry does what anybody does, calls the police and says, hey, what's going on? Texas Highway Patrol then realizes, hey, we should get a search team together.
On December 14th, they bring in Texas Search and Rescue, AKA Texar, and they're a nonprofit that comes in for smaller communities who don't just have the resources to dedicate to large searches like this. And they search several acres of land. Usually they do by ground, they do it by horse, they also do aerial searches as well.
Texas Search and Rescue were out there searching around the crash site for him. Right near where the car was wrecked, there's a hillside, and on the other side of the hill is a retention pond that's maybe a half-acre big. And all the search dogs keep hitting that he went into that pond.
They brought in some swiftwater rescue guys, some dive teams to search this pond. They brought out sonar imaging to image the pond.
They get permission from this owner to actually drain the entire pond. You can hear the pumps running 24 hours a day. And every moment for the first week, I keep expecting the director from Texas Search and Rescue to tell us that they found our son. Words can't describe that living hell. Just waiting for the axe to fall, thinking any moment you're gonna hear that they found your child. And all I can visualize is him floating there in that dirty water. And you don't want him to be there. And then finally, when they drain the pond, he's not there. You're thankful, but where is he? Are we looking in the right places and just haven't found him? Or are we not looking in the right places because he was never there? Or is he lying in some shallow grave somewhere around Luling and we just haven't found him because someone put him there? That's all you can think about. As a dad, your primary responsibility is to protect your kids. And I failed.
Hello, my name is Jason Landry.
I saw Jason every single day the week prior to his disappearance.
So I just got out of the shower and, I was thinking, about things as I do.
That Monday started off completely normal. Like he was the person I'd known him to be and was just doing his day-to-day routine. He spent a lot of time in his bedroom, especially just with online school. Our campus life was just looking at a monitor that semester. Our social life was pretty lackluster. I started noticing Jason was relying a lot more on smoking, and the more he ended up smoking, the more off rails his thought process started going.
The weed's good in the sense that it gives you great ideas and everything, but it's hard to focus as well.
I'm not naive. I went through college too. And to tell me if I am surprised that a 21-year-old in college smokes pot, no, I am not surprised.
I met Jason Landry in 7th grade, and then as the years went by, I got to know him a lot more. When I got to Texas State, I was moving in, and Jason pulls up in the house right next door to me. He was very happy to see someone he knew as well, and seeing him next door gave me a lot more hope for the semester.
Jason was so excited to go to Texas State.
Bro,
What?
I got accepted.
You did? That's amazing. You happy?
Duh.
Of course, COVID hit, and all the fun going out and meeting people were just taken away from him. For some people, if you're really introverted, that's a good thing. But for an extrovert, that's just the worst thing in the world, to lock yourself into a room and not be able to actually connect with people. And I think that really negatively impacted Jason.
I'm tired. I want to go to bed.
I think Jason struggled with the life online. He was really just in his own shell.
What I would always do is, think about all the things I have to do and get overwhelmed by it.
For Jason, he was still, I think, very much in that midst of trying to sort things out and trying to decide what he wanted for his life.
I knew that Jason, over the days up until that point, hadn't been sleeping and eating properly and had only been smoking. That's when I started having concerns for him. But Jason was still completely coherent and cognitive. The night he left, that was the last time I texted Jason.
So Saturday after Jason's disappearance, the search continued with Texar. Helicopters went up, fixed-wing aircraft has gone out, canine teams have gone out. Drone assets were deployed, and we used hundreds of thousands of drone images that were taken. That first week was pretty intense.
We're seeing the helicopters fly in and the dog teams. I can't even begin to imagine how many dog teams have searched for Jason. Seems like every dog in half the United States has been searching for Jason. I'm like, why haven't we found him or any trace of him? Have we been searching in the right place?
After Saturday, we said, hey, if we have not found anything by now, let's cease search operations until we have evidence of one thing or another. We hadn't even built a timeline by that point. So we requested Texar to cease all search operations. And then we started doing the forensics on the car. Our detectives processed that vehicle. They went through every piece of evidence. We collected DNA swabs. We fingerprinted the outside of the car to see if there had been any other potentially viable latent prints that we could retrieve and process. We became very aggressive in our investigation and started looking for video from anybody or anything that was in the area. We're pulling game cameras. We're reaching out to property owners and seeing if they have hidden cameras on their property. We're looking for video from convenience stores. Maybe something happened on the drive from the apartment in San Marcos to the area of the crash. Maybe something happened on the road in between the two, but we were really left with nothing on the video side. We did rely on traditional police work, and we also relied heavily on Jason's digital data. We knew early on one of the key things we wanted was Waze, which has his geolocation data. He was driving through Luling, and it certainly appears that during that travel, he's using Waze for directions.
When you're using apps like Waze, they like pinging you like every time you pass a tower, and so they can see minute by minute where you are. And the thing about using technology is that you can also see when they close it out. And I think that's really been a game changer for investigators.
It appears that he minimizes ways and opens up Snapchat. He's looking at a story on his phone, and he misses his turn. He should turn right. He proceeds straight. Looking at all the evidence we've collected, we can document every second of Jason's travel from his apartment in San Marcos, the entire route into Luling, where we believe he misses his turn. We have every second accounted for. And then Jason has a single vehicle collision, but we don't know why. What contributed to that collision? Could a deer or a hog or something jumped out in the road and he overcorrected? Could have. Could it have been Jason dropped his phone, if he's digging around for his phone, overcorrected, had a single vehicle collision, and then left the vehicle on his own? Certainly feels like that's the most plausible. It really is two separate questions, though. You know, what happened to Jason? Where is Jason? This is America, and you're allowed to disappear. If you want to start another life, you can do that. That's not something we've encountered, but it is a possibility. So is this an involuntary missing? Is this a voluntary missing? Fast forward a couple months, now there's these creation of these Facebook groups. Now the media is heavily involved.
A missing person billboard can now be found along Highway 183 going from Luling to Lockhart in hopes of bringing home missing Texas State student Jason Landry.
I've been covering this since December of 2020 when we learned that Jason had gone missing. And this case seemed to resonate with the community more than any other case that I've seen. People see something like this happen and they're like, oh my gosh, that could literally be my kid.
You can't imagine you're waiting for a phone call, but you dread a phone call. And then you wonder, how long are you going to be waiting? And it's just, every day is another day.
It's likely that Jason wanders into the woods. I do believe firmly that we just haven't found him. We know that the area where Jason goes missing has a lot of wild hogs. And these are 200-300-pound critters.
We know that there is a wild hog problem in Central Texas. Wild hogs can destroy thousands of dollars of crops and property. And so if Jason was somewhere in the woods unconscious, I think there's a possibility that wildlife could have gotten to his body.
When there's a scarcity of food, hogs will not miss a meal, especially in December, January, February. Is it possible that that's why we've not been able to find a body? Maybe. It's possible he's gone.
In my opinion, Caldwell County Sheriff's Office don't seem to want to think about a possibility that it's anything other than a one-car accident and that Jason wandered off in the field and got eaten by feral hogs, period. There's nothing to be done in their mind because, you know, there's nothing left of Jason. Too bad, so sad. But maybe it's not a single car accident. Let's broaden the scope. Let's use all the tools that are available.
My name is Abel Pena, retired from the FBI after 26 and a half years. I've worked a number of missing persons cases while employed with the FBI. My daughter attends Texas State, and she told me about a friend of hers that was missing. It hit close to home. Jason was characterized by my daughter as just a very pleasant, very happy-go-lucky, free spirit, but a very warm and loving person. My daughter used to date his best friend, and so there was this closeness that they had.
Jason was just one of those people that was kind of I think a glue person that keeps a group of people together. He was one that had a lot of good friends and impacted a lot of lives. And it was a friend of his who told her dad, "Hey, Dad, have you heard about this one?" And he contacted us and said, "Hey, I think I might be able to help you."
We're part of Project Capcentus, which is a nonprofit. We've got a team of retired FBI agents, Border Patrol. We've got some other intel folks. So we're there to kind of provide that bridge between the family of the missing and be there for assistance to local or state authorities. We offered our services free of charge to the Landry family.
To have someone else besides Caldwell County Sheriff's Office looking at it makes us happy. Put a different set of eyes on this. Maybe they can look at the same facts and get a different conclusion.
I reached out to the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department, and it can be a little bit of a balancing act. You don't want to appear like you're trying to take over. What we wanted to do was work together, trying to locate Jason.
We felt comfortable sharing information because we were all working towards the same goal, finding Jason, getting answers.
When we first started this investigation, you want to look at the victim. From that picture, you can determine his habits, his behavior. The Sheriff's Department believed that Jason was so high, he crashed that vehicle. But most college kids, they smoke marijuana, they get high. And so, by all accounts, Jason was a normal college kid experimenting with marijuana. As an investigator, you want to make sure you allow other possibilities. Initially, I felt a bit critical about the way it was handled. The red flag for many of us would have been the clothes. Just to see the clothes laid out the way they were along the road. The whole area was trampled on, tampered with, and the vehicle was towed immediately. If there was any evidence left behind, it was destroyed. We also had a lot of questions as to why Jason drove down Salt Flat Road. Why did he miss that turn? Was he distracted? Was he lost? Did somebody guide him down that road? We started going door to door along Salt Flat Road and also along Austin Magnolia at the intersection. So we started talking to people. And while it didn't really get us too much, it still gave us an understanding of the area and of some of the neighbors, some of the people in the town. We start learning that there is a drug problem out there, a major drug problem. Drugs just are wreaking havoc on Luling. So we learned that there is some bad people.
Recently, we've had an uptick in violent crime, a lot more violent encounters, a lot more murder cases. Certainly it's been more violent than it has been any other time in my 19-year career. But you're gonna have bad people all over the country.
As we continued knocking on doors, a lot of people in Luling were very forthcoming with us.
We continue to follow the disappearance of Texas State student Jason Landry.
Jason Landry disappeared in December of 2020 on his way back from his college in San Marcos to his home near Houston for Christmas break. Law enforcement say his car was found crashed in Luling with Jason nowhere to be found.
And I don't think he walked away from his life just like that. And so somebody knows something, and we think it's local.
Many, however, were reluctant. They would say they know things, but were just too afraid to talk because of drug dealers nearby. We felt it was beneficial to set up a tip line to receive incoming calls from people that felt uncomfortable calling the police. I mean, they're deathly scared of what could happen if these people learned that they were involved in telling us who was involved. We didn't feel that the tip line was going to receive a lot of calls, but we did. And the consistency of calls about what happened to Jason that night was too overwhelming to ignore. The information we're receiving is that something nefarious happened to him.
Jason Landry was last seen December 13th, 2020. If you have any information, please contact the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office at 512-398-6777.
Any tip we received, we vetted out. There was a sighting of Jason near Dallas. We traveled up there and knocked on the door, and we met with the person that they believed was Jason. It wasn't obviously Jason. We sent people out to Austin because there were sightings at some of the homeless camps, a sighting here in San Antonio. We checked that out. We traveled and we vetted a lot of these leads in the hope that Jason was out there. And so we continued pressing forward, talking to more and more people from our anonymous tip line. The information we're receiving is that Jason encountered individuals at that intersection of Magnolia and Austin Street, and something happened to him. We're not sure what at this point, but something we believe nefarious happened to him. And we were told he may not have been driving the vehicle. From that intersection to where the vehicle was found down South Flat Road, roughly 4 miles away, somebody may have driven that vehicle and crashed that vehicle purposely.
See, those are 2 pairs of socks, shorts.
And then thrown his clothes around to make it look like something happened there, which steered the investigation at the onset.
I can see where he went sideways.
The crazy thing about this case is it's all reduced down to 1 hour. What happened between 11:30 and 12:30 between that point in Luling and Salt Flat Road? What happened in 1 hour over about a 3-mile stretch of road?
I want to be careful what I say here. We received several names from these anonymous calls of the people that would say they were involved or may have knowledge of Jason's disappearance. They said Jason was accosted by individuals at that location, but they're saying that even if these guys are arrested, they're worried about the families and just the repercussions that result in them being considered snitches.
Luling is a small rural community where folks have been for generations. And when it comes to talking with the cops, I think there's always a fear when some kind of case is being investigated.
I received a letter at my home address. It was a bit creepy receiving a letter that I had no clue who it was from, but it described in fairly good detail everything we've been hearing on our anonymous tip line. If they were making this up, I do not believe they would go through the effort to find my home address. They wanted to make sure that that information got specifically to me, and it was received.
We are familiar with the information that the private investigators were able to collect, and we're familiar with some of their beliefs. But people have different motivations for sharing information. People say things because there's no consequences, right? Well, then you hear that, and then you tell somebody, and then it's that classic telephone game, right? All of which makes investigations difficult.
Some crazy person sent me an email saying that Jason was disposed of by a wood chipper, like in the movie Fargo. And to think that they would send that to me, then you visualize that happening to your child. And I pray that that's not true.
We try to make the story make sense with the information we have. I mean, I guess if I'm a 21-year-old coming from a college town, which is full of narcotics, I guess it's possible you could stop in Luling, Texas at 11:30 at night and randomly encounter convicts on the corner, and that they would force your vehicle off the road or kill you and then stage the single vehicle collision, which we don't believe happened. But that's what was getting said, and that's what the PIs kept hearing, and so by God, it's gotta be true, because people keep telling us. Well, it's my opinion, the only way the private investigators' theories can flesh out is if you discount all of the hard evidence, and that's really when we stopped having a relationship with the private investigator.
If you believe that Jason just walked off and disappeared, in my opinion, there's not going to be much effort in trying to look at this case as anything other than a missing persons case. And it's important as an investigator to explore really all options. And that's to look at the possibility that something criminal could have happened to Jason. So they're treating this as a missing persons case, but there was DNA samples taken, as well as fingerprints from Jason's car. You can process the prints, you can try to run it through the system and see if it matches with any known prints.
I've tried enough cases in criminal court and civil court to know that there's so many databases and stuff that you can search for. If you have the DNA material, you can search for a hit.
That DNA evidence is not really evidence of anything. I mean, it's evidence that somebody else was in the car. Well, how many people have ever been in your car? We have to have evidence of a crime. And if we thought for a second that DNA evidence would get us any closer to what happened to Jason Landry, wholeheartedly and assuredly, we would do that. But, you know, that gets to a point where we don't have anything else to update. So that's frustrating. We don't ever hang it up, right? We just continue to trudge on, we continue to work.
I just want them to do their job and find answers.
Since Jason's disappearance 6 months ago, the Landry family has become no stranger to the city of Luling.
When we come here, it's all, what that makes me think of is it's so hard every time we leave again without him.
And they say they'll keep coming until they find out what happened to their son.
Just help us find him. We just want to find him.
If someone hurt Jason or did something to Jason, then they better be brought to justice.
And first tonight, a prayer vigil in Missouri City for 21-year-old Jason Landry. The student at Texas State has now been missing for 1 year.
Fox 26's Matthew Seedorf is live outside Southminster Presbyterian Church tonight, where a vigil for Jason just wrapped up. Matthew.
An emotional night for family and friends here.
There's one here at the church, and the one in Luling was set up by some of the locals there.
My family did attend the candlelight ceremony. I wasn't able to make it myself because of my work schedule, which I do think about a lot. I feel like that was a very important thing to be present for. Jason was always known for wearing his silly socks, and so I was texting his mom, and I was just saying I'm wearing my silly socks sitting here thinking about y'all.
It's amazing how many people turned out for both of those. And to be honest, I wasn't in either one. I stayed out all night by where the accident was. Just by myself and Jason. And there's no good reason why, I just needed to. It's the same reason why you go put flowers on a loved one's grave on their birthday or on the anniversary of their death. You need to be there in that space.
At the 1 year mark, we're still actively investigating. We're still looking for information. And we remain available to the Landrys if they have questions, but I think our relationship is strained.
The Attorney General's office opened up a cold case unit at the end of 2021. They just took the Landry case on in December, I believe. For the Landry family means that there is going to be a fresh set of eyes and a fresh set of investigators taking on Jason's case, looking at all of the evidence, maybe looking at something that the Caldwell County Sheriff's Office missed or the private investigator might have missed. And hopefully we find an answer that wasn't there before and can give the Landry family the closure that they're looking for.
The Texas Attorney General's missing person unit did not exist when Jason went missing. I'm hopeful that the AG's office has another technique or another tool. So the fact that they were willing to step up and go, yeah, we'll take a crack at it, we're very appreciative of that.
I believe it is a turning point. I believe it is good for the case to, again, look at it from a different set of eyes. The Attorney General's investigator is aware of the people and the witnesses, and we're grateful that they've reached out to us and consider us a resource. That's what we're here for.
Hopefully, the Attorney General's office might be able to break through that impasse and maybe get some new useful information and crack the case.
The people in our community want to know, is there a bad guy out there? Is there some nefarious character that's visiting harm to our friends and our family and our community? What we can say with confidence is that we don't think so, right? We don't believe that to be true. I maintain, and this is a tragedy, but it's not a crime. There's no reason to believe that anybody in the world has information on Jason Landry except Jason Landry.
Jason resonated with many of the people in a special way. I mean, strangers around the country that speak of Jason, there's Facebook pages and their sole purpose is to find Jason. I hear the passion in their posts about, Jason being just like their son.
I do hold out hope. I hope that for his family's sake, there's an answer. A day doesn't go by where I don't think about the friend that I lost and how hard it's been since then. He was a really good person and a good friend.
I thank God for Jason, for the man.
On September 22, 1994, investigators in Ontario opened a door that should have remained nothing more than an ordinary door. Behind it were videotapes. At first glance, they were only objects. Small plastic cases containing recorded images, the kind of thing that could have been sitting in thousands of homes across Canada at the time. But these tapes were different. They did not simply contain evidence of a crime. They contained a version of the truth that the police had never seen. A truth that would force investigators to look backward at a series of terrible events they thought they understood. A truth that would change the public's perception of a young woman who had already been sentenced to 12 years in prison. And a truth that would expose one of the most disturbing criminal partnerships in Canadian history. The names were Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. For years, their story had seemed to fit a relatively simple pattern. There was a dangerous man. There were young women who had disappeared or been attacked. There was a wife who claimed she had been trapped inside an abusive relationship with that man. And then there was a courtroom deal that gave that wife 12 years behind bars. But by the autumn of 1994, investigators were beginning to realize that the story they had been told was not the story that had happened. The tapes were the difference. Before the tapes, there were questions. After the tapes, there were answers. And some answers were worse than the questions. To understand why those tapes were so devastating, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to Ontario in the late 1980s. Back to a time when a predator was moving through suburban streets, looking for women who believed they were simply going about their ordinary lives. Back to Scarborough. It was not a place that looked like the setting of a nightmare. That was part of what made the fear so difficult to understand. Scarborough was made up of neighborhoods, apartment buildings, shopping centers, schools, busy roads, and quiet residential streets. People went to work in the morning. Teenagers waited for buses. Parents returned home with groceries. Cars moved through intersections beneath ordinary streetlights. Life did not announce that something terrible was happening. There was no warning in the sky. No dark figure waiting in every doorway. The danger was hidden inside normality. During the late 1980s, women in the Scarborough area began reporting sexual assaults. The cases shared similarities. Investigators began to see a pattern. A man was attacking women, and he seemed to be able to disappear back into the same ordinary world from which he had emerged. Eventually, the unknown attacker acquired a name in the media. The Scarborough Rapist. For the women who survived him, he was not a headline. He was a face. A voice. A memory that could return without warning. And while police worked to identify him, the man responsible was living a life that, from the outside, could appear remarkably ordinary. His name was Paul Bernardo. Born in 1964, Bernardo grew up in the Toronto area. By the time he was an adult, there was nothing about his outward appearance that automatically announced the danger he represented. He could move through public spaces without immediately attracting suspicion. That would become one of the most disturbing characteristics of his story. predators rarely walk around carrying a sign that tells strangers what they are. Sometimes they look ordinary. Sometimes they are charming. Sometimes they are the person who smiles when someone else is watching. And sometimes, the most frightening thing about a criminal is not how strange he looks, but how easily he can disappear into the crowd. Bernardo was eventually linked to a growing number of sexual assaults. But the story was about to become much darker. Because somewhere along the way, Bernardo met Karla Homolka. She was young. She was intelligent. She came from a respectable family. And she would eventually become his wife. To the outside world, their relationship could look like the beginning of an ordinary adult life. A young couple. A relationship. A marriage. A future. But behind closed doors, something else was taking shape. Something that would eventually involve death. The first death at the center of the case was not a stranger. It was someone Karla Homolka knew intimately. Her younger sister, Tammy. Tammy's death would later become one of the most painful pieces of the entire investigation, because she was not a distant figure in a case file. She was family. She was Karla's sister. And after Tammy died, the full circumstances surrounding her death were not immediately understood by investigators. At the time, the larger horror remained hidden. Then came Leslie Mahaffey. Then Kristen French. Two young women whose names would become permanently connected to the Bernardo case. They were not symbols. They were not characters created for a crime story. They were daughters. Friends. Young women with ordinary futures ahead of them. Their lives had nothing to do with the nightmare that was approaching. Leslie Mahaffey disappeared in 1991. Kristen French disappeared the following year. Two disappearances. Two families waiting for answers. Two young lives suddenly interrupted. And slowly, investigators began to understand that these events might not be isolated. There was a predator in Ontario. And he was no longer simply a man associated with a series of sexual assaults. The investigation was moving toward something much worse. Yet the most disturbing part of the story was still hidden. Because while investigators were trying to understand Paul Bernardo, they were also trying to understand Karla Homolka. What was her role? Was she another victim? Was she an unwilling participant? Was she manipulated by Bernardo? Or was the truth somewhere much darker? Those questions would eventually become central to one of the most controversial prosecutorial decisions in modern Canadian criminal history. But before the public knew the answers, there was a moment when the balance of the investigation began to shift. January 1993. Karla Homolka approached police. She presented herself as a woman who had suffered abuse at the hands of her husband. She had information about Bernardo. And that information mattered. For investigators, Karla represented something they desperately needed, a person who could potentially connect Bernardo to crimes that were otherwise difficult to prove. DNA evidence had also begun to transform the investigation. On February 1, 1993, forensic evidence linked Bernardo to sexual assaults. The walls were closing in. But there was a problem. The case against Bernardo was not yet the complete story. And the prosecution believed that Karla Homolka could help them build it. That belief would lead to a decision that would haunt the case for decades. On May 14, 1993, Homolka entered into an agreement with prosecutors. She agreed to cooperate. She agreed to testify against Bernardo. She pleaded guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter. And in exchange, she received a 12-year sentence. 12 years. For a case involving the deaths of young women. For a case that had already horrified Ontario. For a case whose full details were largely hidden from the public. At that moment, the public did not know what investigators would later discover. The courtroom was surrounded by secrecy. A publication ban restricted what could be reported. Information that might have changed public understanding of Homolka's role could not simply be broadcast across newspapers and television screens. So a narrative began to take shape. Bernardo was the monster. Homolka was the battered wife who had become trapped beside him. The public could see the outline of the story, but not the whole picture. And then, in 1994, investigators found the tapes. Imagine the moment. A detective looking at evidence that has already been collected. A recording. A face. A room. Images preserved from a time when the victims were still alive. There are moments in an investigation when evidence does more than prove something. It changes the meaning of everything that came before it. The tapes were one of those moments. They revealed that Karla Homolka's role was far more complicated and far more disturbing than the public had been led to believe. She was not simply the powerless wife described in the earlier narrative. The recordings showed her participation in crimes. And suddenly, the 12-year sentence became the center of a storm. Because the agreement with Homolka had already been signed. The evidence that might have changed the prosecution's position had been discovered too late. The legal system now had a problem with no easy solution. A deal had been made. A sentence had been imposed. And then the evidence changed the story. Imagine being one of the families waiting for the truth. Imagine hearing that the woman who had helped investigators was serving 12 years. Imagine learning later that there had been evidence showing a much more active role in the crimes. The anger was not simply about numbers. It was about trust. Trust in investigators. Trust in prosecutors. Trust in the justice system. And above all, trust that the people responsible for terrible acts would be held accountable. For the families of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French, there could never be a version of the story that restored what had been taken from them. No sentence could return a daughter. No courtroom could reverse a death. No videotape could undo the suffering. Justice could only attempt to answer one question. Who was responsible? And how much responsibility did each person carry? Paul Bernardo would eventually stand trial. He would be convicted of the first-degree murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. He would receive life imprisonment. He would also be designated a dangerous offender, meaning his imprisonment would not simply end because a particular number of years had passed. But even after Bernardo's conviction, the case would not become simple. Because Karla Homolka had already been sentenced. And the public had already seen two very different versions of her. One was the frightened wife. The other was the woman revealed by the tapes. Between those two images lies one of the most difficult questions in the entire case. How does a person become capable of participating in another person's suffering? How does a relationship cross the invisible line between control and collaboration? And when someone says they were manipulated, how do investigators determine where manipulation ends and responsibility begins? Those questions cannot be answered simply by looking at a photograph. They cannot be answered by listening to a single statement. And they cannot be answered by giving a criminal a label and walking away. The human mind is rarely that simple. That is part of what makes this case so disturbing. Paul Bernardo was not an apparition. Karla Homolka was not a fictional accomplice. Leslie Mahaffey was not a name invented for a documentary. Kristen French was not a character in a horror film. Tammy Homolka was not merely a piece of evidence. They were real people. They had families. They had routines. They had voices. They had futures that, at one point, seemed as ordinary and open-ended as anyone else's. And then those futures collided with two people who would become synonymous with one of Canada's most infamous criminal cases. The story is often remembered through the nickname given to Bernardo and Homolka by the media, the Ken and Barbie killers. The nickname was memorable. It was also dangerously misleading. Because it made something horrifying sound almost theatrical. A glamorous couple. A shocking secret. A forbidden relationship. A true crime legend. But behind that mythology were victims whose lives were not glamorous, mysterious, or fictional. There were families who had to sit through court proceedings. There were parents who had to hear details no parent should ever have to hear. There were investigators who had to reconstruct events long after they occurred. There was a surviving victim whose identity was protected in court and whose existence became known through the evidence. And there was a society trying to understand how two apparently ordinary people could become capable of extraordinary cruelty. The tapes did not simply reveal what happened. They destroyed an illusion. And once that illusion was gone, the case looked different from every angle. The police investigation looked different. The prosecution's agreement with Homolka looked different. The public's understanding of her looked different. And the relationship between Bernardo and Homolka looked different. The most frightening cases are sometimes not the ones where evil announces itself. They are the ones where it hides behind familiar faces. A house. A marriage. A neighborhood. A smile. A promise. A life that appears ordinary from the street. 4 years, people had been trying to understand the man known as the Scarborough rapist. But the deeper they went, the more disturbing the answer became. This was not simply the story of a predator who acted alone. It was the story of a relationship that became a place where violence could grow. It was the story of young women whose lives ended before their futures could unfold. It was the story of a sister whose death was initially misunderstood. It was the story of an investigation that depended on evidence that did not arrive in time. It was the story of a plea agreement that would become one of the most controversial bargains in Canadian criminal justice. And it was the story of a handful of videotapes that waited silently for investigators to find them. On September 22, 1994, those tapes changed everything. But they did not change the past. They could not bring Leslie Mahaffey home. They could not bring Kristen French home. They could not give Tammy Homolka another chance to live. They could not erase the memories carried by the surviving victim. They could only expose what had been hidden. And sometimes, in a criminal investigation, the truth does not arrive like a revelation. Sometimes it arrives slowly, piece by piece. A name. A photograph. A DNA match. A statement. A disappearance. A contradiction. A courtroom agreement. And finally, a recording. A recording that forces everyone to look again. At the beginning of this story, investigators were searching for a man. By the end, they would be confronting something much more complicated. Not just who Paul Bernardo was, but who Karla Homolka was. What she had done. What she claimed had been done to her. What the evidence actually showed. And whether the justice system could ever fully reconcile those competing versions of the truth. The story begins in a place that looked ordinary. A Canadian suburb. Quiet streets. Everyday lives. People going to work. Teenagers making plans. Families expecting their daughters to come home. And somewhere within that ordinary landscape was a man whose crimes would eventually become one of the darkest chapters in Ontario's history. His name was Paul Bernardo. The woman beside him was Karla Homolka. And before investigators understood the full horror of what had happened, 3 young women would become central to their story. 1 was a sister. 2 were strangers. And 1 more young woman would survive long enough to tell investigators that the nightmare was real. The question was no longer whether something terrible had happened. The question was how much of it had been hidden. And how long the truth had been waiting to be found. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from realizing the person you thought you understood was never the person you actually knew. It is the fear of looking back at an ordinary photograph and seeing something different in it. The face has not changed. The eyes have not changed. The clothes are still the same. But the meaning has changed. That is what happened in the case of Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. 4 years, investigators, prosecutors, journalists, and eventually the public would look at photographs of the couple and ask the same question in different ways. What was really happening behind closed doors? The question sounds simple. It was anything but. Because criminal investigations are usually built from fragments. A witness remembers a face. A family reports someone missing. A forensic technician discovers biological evidence. A police officer notices that 2 seemingly unrelated cases have something in common. A suspect gives a statement. Another person gives a different statement. Each piece is small. sometimes almost meaningless by itself. But investigators place those pieces together and hope a picture emerges. In the Bernardo case, the picture was changing while investigators were still trying to draw it. At first, Paul Bernardo appeared to be the central figure. He was the man connected to the attacks in Scarborough. He was the person investigators wanted. The women who survived his attacks carried memories of him. The police had descriptions. They had evidence. They had patterns. But they did not yet have the entire story. And that distinction would become critical. Because the man known as the Scarborough rapist would eventually be connected not only to sexual assaults, but to the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. And beside him was Karla Homolka, a woman who would later tell a story of fear, control, and abuse. A woman who would enter into a deal with prosecutors. A woman who would serve 12 years. And a woman whose image would change forever when investigators discovered what had been recorded on videotape. The story is difficult partly because the human mind wants clear categories. Victim. Predator. Accomplice. Witness. Liar. Monster. In reality, criminal cases rarely fit so neatly. A person can be manipulated and still make choices. A person can be frightened and still harm another person. A person can live inside an abusive relationship and still bear responsibility for actions taken within it. And a person can tell the truth about one part of a story while hiding another. That is why the evidence mattered so much. The evidence had no sympathy. It did not care about appearances. It did not care who cried in an interview room. It did not care who looked frightened in court. It simply preserved what had happened. And in this case, some of the most important evidence was not discovered until after the public had already been given a version of the story. To understand the significance of that, it is necessary to return to the beginning of the investigation. Scarborough in the late 1980s. The city was changing. Toronto was growing. The neighborhoods surrounding Scarborough were filled with people living ordinary lives, often without ever thinking about the possibility that a serial sexual predator might be operating nearby. There was a rhythm to the area. Morning traffic. Apartment elevators. School corridors. Shopping centers. Cars pulling into driveways. Streetlights turning on as evening arrived. The kind of environment where people naturally assume that tomorrow will look much like today. Then the attacks began to form a pattern. Women were being assaulted. Investigators compared reports. Descriptions were examined. Locations were mapped. Timelines were reconstructed. Each new case made the pattern harder to dismiss. Someone was hunting women. Someone was watching. Someone was choosing opportunities. And somewhere in the same region, Paul Bernardo was living his life. That contrast is important. Because when people hear the word serial predator, they often imagine someone who exists completely outside normal society. A stranger. A loner. Someone visibly dangerous. But Bernardo did not need to live outside society. He could exist inside it. He could drive through the same streets. Enter the same stores. Speak to neighbors. Have relationships. Make plans. Smile. And then, according to the evidence, return to violence. That ability to separate public appearance from private behavior would become one of the defining features of the case. Then came Karla. When Bernardo and Homolka met, there was no way for the people around them to know what their relationship would eventually become. To family members, they were a young couple. They had plans. They had a relationship that appeared to be moving toward marriage. There were ordinary conversations. Ordinary celebrations. Ordinary photographs. Nothing about the surface necessarily announced what was beneath it. And that is where the story becomes psychologically disturbing. Because relationships are built on private worlds. Two people can create a reality that outsiders cannot fully see. Inside that private world, boundaries can shift. Behaviors that once seemed unacceptable can become normalized. A person can test another person's limits. Then test them again. What begins as something shocking can, through repetition and manipulation, become something that the people involved no longer describe in the same language. This does not excuse criminal behavior. It helps explain why investigators later had to look beyond the simple question of who committed an act. They had to ask how two people came to participate in the same world. What did Bernardo want? What did Homolka want? What did she fear? What did she believe she had to do? What did she choose? And at what point did she stop being merely someone caught inside another person's violence and become an active participant? Those questions would never have simple answers. Then came Tammy. Tammy Homolka was Carla's younger sister. Her death in 1990 would become one of the central events of the entire case. But at first, the full truth surrounding her death was not known. That fact is difficult to comprehend from the perspective of everything that would later emerge. Imagine a family grieving the death of a daughter. Imagine believing you know the circumstances. Imagine the funeral. The photographs. The unanswered questions that families often carry after a sudden death. Now imagine learning years later that the circumstances were far more disturbing than you had ever been told. Tammy's death became a painful dividing line in the story. Before Tammy, there was already evidence of Bernardo's criminal behavior. After Tammy, the case would eventually become something much darker. But investigators did not immediately have that complete picture. That is one of the cruel realities of criminal investigations. Sometimes the truth exists before anyone is capable of recognizing it. The evidence can be sitting in front of people. The significance simply has not yet become visible. Then came Leslie Mahaffey. Leslie was young. She had a family. She had friends. She had routines. And then, in 1991, she disappeared. For her family, the disappearance would have begun with uncertainty. Maybe she was late. Maybe she had gone somewhere without telling anyone. Maybe there had been a misunderstanding. That is how many missing person cases begin. Someone waits. Then someone calls. Then the waiting becomes worry. The worry becomes fear. The fear becomes a police report. Investigators begin asking questions. Where was she last seen? Who had spoken to her? Where had she planned to go? What did she have with her? Who might have known where she was? At first, every possibility remains open. An accident. A voluntary disappearance. A misunderstanding. A stranger. Someone she knew. But as time passes, possibilities begin to disappear. And when a missing person is young and the circumstances are suspicious, investigators know that every hour matters. Leslie would not come home. Her disappearance would eventually be connected to Bernardo and Homolka. But even then, the full extent of what had happened was not immediately known. The following year, another young woman disappeared. Kristen French. Her disappearance would become the second major murder case against Bernardo. And suddenly, investigators were facing a pattern that could not be ignored. 2 young women. 2 disappearances. A growing body of evidence. And a man already suspected of serious sexual offenses. The possibility that these cases were connected became increasingly difficult to deny. Yet the investigation was still missing something. A complete bridge between the crimes and the people responsible. That bridge would eventually come from several directions. Forensic evidence. Witness information. Statements. And eventually, Carla Homolka herself. By early 1993, the pressure was increasing. Bernardo was no longer simply a suspect hidden somewhere in the background. Evidence was beginning to converge around him. On February 1st, DNA evidence linked him to sexual assaults. For investigators, forensic science was changing the landscape. A DNA profile could do something a witness could not. It could connect a person to biological evidence. It could strengthen a case that might otherwise depend heavily on memory. And it could make it much harder for a suspect to disappear behind uncertainty. But investigators still faced a major problem. They needed evidence concerning the murders. They needed to know what had happened to Leslie Mahaffey. They needed to understand what had happened to Kristen French. And they needed to understand the role of Homoka. Then Homoka approached police. She described herself as a woman who had been abused by Bernardo. Her account presented a particular image of their relationship. Bernardo was the dominant figure. Homoka was afraid. She had information. She could potentially help investigators. For prosecutors, this created an extraordinarily difficult calculation. If Homoka could help secure Bernardo's conviction, should they make a deal with her? How much responsibility should she bear? How much evidence did prosecutors actually have? What could they prove? What could they not prove? And perhaps the most important question of all, what did they not yet know? On May 14, 1993, the decision was made. Homoka would cooperate. She would plead guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter. And she would receive a 12-year sentence. At the time, prosecutors believed the agreement was necessary. They believed that without Homoka's cooperation, securing convictions against Bernardo for the murders would be extremely difficult. It was a calculated decision. A decision made with the evidence available at that moment. But there was something the prosecutors did not have. The tapes. That would change everything. For months, the public knew only part of the story. The courtroom proceedings were subject to strict publication restrictions. People could not simply read every detail in their morning newspaper. They could not watch every piece of evidence on television. The information landscape was fragmented. Rumors circulated. People speculated. Some journalists tried to understand what was happening. Others were forced to remain silent. The public knew that something terrible had happened. But they did not know how terrible. And then came September 22, 1994. The tapes were discovered. There is something uniquely disturbing about recorded evidence. A written statement can be disputed. A memory can change. A witness can misunderstand. But a recording preserves an image from a particular moment. It captures people as they were. It does not ask permission. It does not soften the past. And the recordings found in the Bernardo investigation exposed a reality that contradicted the image of Homoka that many people had accepted. The tapes showed her participation. They revealed that she was not simply the helpless wife that the public narrative had suggested. And suddenly, the legal agreement from the year before looked completely different. The discovery raised a devastating hypothetical. What if prosecutors had known? What if they had seen the tapes before May 14, 1993? Would Homoka have received the same deal? The answer from the later governmental review was clear. If the prosecution had possessed the tapes at the time, the agreement would not have been made in the same form. But that answer came after the fact. The deal already existed. The sentence had already been imposed. The legal machinery had already moved forward. And the justice system now had to deal with a problem created by its own lack of information. For the public, however, the emotional reaction was much simpler. People were furious. They saw 12 years. They saw the tapes. They saw the victims. And they struggled to understand how those 3 things could exist in the same case. Families who had already suffered unimaginable loss now had to watch the public debate over the person they believed had helped cause that loss. The case became a national obsession. Newspapers filled with headlines. Television programs dissected every development. The nickname Ken and Barbie killers entered popular culture. But beneath the sensationalism was a much more painful reality. There were names that deserved to be remembered without a nickname attached to them. Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, Tammy Homoka, and the surviving victim whose identity was protected as Jane Doe. These were the people whose lives should remain at the center of the story. Not the photographs of Bernardo. Not the fascination with Homoka. Not the mythology created around the couple. The victims. Always the victims. Because true crime has a dangerous tendency to turn perpetrators into celebrities. The more shocking the crime, the more attention the offender receives. Photographs are reproduced. Childhood histories are examined. Psychological profiles are written. Every expression becomes evidence of some hidden darkness. Meanwhile, the people who were killed can become secondary characters in their own stories. That must be resisted. Leslie was not born to become a murder victim. Kristen was not born to become evidence. Tammy was not born to become a footnote in her sister's criminal history. They were people before they became names in court documents. And that distinction matters. When Bernardo eventually stood trial, the prosecution would present evidence connecting him to the murders. He would be convicted of first-degree murder in the deaths of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French. He would receive life imprisonment. He would be designated a dangerous offender. But the courtroom could establish only what the evidence and law allowed it to establish. It could not reconstruct every private moment. It could not explain every decision. It could not completely answer why. And that final question is perhaps the most uncomfortable. Why? Why would someone who could appear ordinary become capable of such violence? Why would another person participate? Why would a relationship become a place where cruelty was permitted to grow? Why did the warning signs fail to stop what happened? And why did the justice system, despite the efforts of investigators and prosecutors, fail to see the entire picture until after a critical agreement had already been made? There is no single answer. There rarely is. Criminal behavior is not created by one event alone. It can involve personality, opportunity, control, obsession, manipulation, environment, and choice. But understanding those factors should never become an excuse. Explanation is not forgiveness. Understanding is not absolution. And psychological analysis must never erase responsibility. That is especially important in a case like this. Because the temptation is to reduce Bernardo to a monster and Homolka to either a victim or a villain. But the reality was more difficult. The evidence forced investigators and the public to confront uncomfortable shades of responsibility. And the tapes became the symbol of that complexity. They were not merely recordings. They were the moment when the story people thought they knew collided with the story the evidence revealed. Before the tapes, the public had one picture. After the tapes, they had another. Between those two pictures were the victims. And somewhere between those two pictures was the truth. A truth that had taken years to emerge. A truth that would shape two trials. A truth that would create anger across Canada. A truth that would forever change how the country remembered the names Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka. But there was another reason this case remained so haunting. The story was not only about what happened. It was about what almost happened differently. If investigators had found certain evidence earlier. If the significance of Tammy's death had been understood sooner. If the full role of Homolka had been known before the plea agreement. If the tapes had been discovered before May 1993. The legal history of the case might have looked completely different. History does not offer alternate endings. But criminal investigations are built around those moments when one piece of evidence arrives too late, or just in time. In this case, the evidence arrived too late to change one sentence. But it arrived early enough to change everything that followed. And that is where the story truly begins. Not with the courtroom. Not with the media storm. Not even with the discovery of the tapes. It begins with ordinary people living ordinary lives in Ontario. People who had no reason to believe that their paths would cross with one of the most notorious criminal partnerships in Canadian history. It begins with a young woman named Leslie Mahaffey. It begins with a young woman named Kristen French. It begins with Tammy Homolka. It begins with the survivor known in court as Jane Doe. And it begins with a man who spent years moving through ordinary streets while carrying a secret that would eventually destroy the lives of countless people around him. The closer investigators came to Paul Bernardo, the more they discovered. And the more they discovered, the less simple the story became. Because sometimes the first person you identify as the monster is not the only person who must answer for what happened. Sometimes the person standing beside him knows more than anyone realizes. Sometimes the truth is not hidden in a confession. Sometimes it is sitting on a videotape. Waiting. Silent. Undisturbed. Until someone finally presses play. And when they do, the past comes alive again. Not as a story. Not as a rumor. Not as a headline. But as evidence. And once that evidence is seen, it cannot be unseen. There is a moment in almost every investigation when the past stops being a collection of unanswered questions and becomes something much more frightening. A pattern. At first, investigators see separate incidents. A woman attacked. Another woman attacked. A missing person. Another missing person. A name appearing in one report. A vehicle appearing in another. A description repeated by someone who is trying desperately to remember a face. Each incident exists inside its own small world. Its own police report. Its own family. Its own fear. But eventually, someone places the reports side by side. And suddenly, the distance between them begins to disappear. That was happening in Ontario. The attacks connected to the man who became known as the Scarborough Rapist were no longer isolated events. They were pieces of a larger picture. A picture that investigators had been trying to complete while the person responsible continued to live an outwardly ordinary life. That contradiction would become one of the most disturbing elements of the Bernardo case. Because there is something deeply unsettling about discovering that a person capable of unimaginable violence could still participate in the rituals of everyday life. He could wake up in the morning. He could eat breakfast. He could drive a car. He could walk into a store. He could speak to another person and appear completely normal. Nothing about an ordinary street tells you who is dangerous. Nothing about a house tells you what happens behind its walls. A closed door can hide a family dinner. It can hide an argument. It can hide a secret. And sometimes, investigators do not understand what was happening behind that door until years later. This is where the story of Paul Bernardo becomes inseparable from the story of Karla Homolka. Their relationship has been analyzed repeatedly because it raises questions that are difficult to answer even when the evidence is clear. How much influence did one person have over the other? How much did Bernardo manipulate Homolka? When did Homolka begin participating willingly? Did fear explain her actions? Did dependence explain them? Did obsession? Did the desire to please a partner? Or was there something else? The answers matter because the difference between coercion and participation is not merely psychological. It is legal. It is moral. It is human. And in this case, the difference would affect the lives of everyone connected to the investigation. The public would eventually learn that Homolka had entered into a plea agreement with prosecutors. But at the beginning of 1993, the situation looked very different. Investigators were trying to build a case against Bernardo. They knew about the sexual assaults. They had evidence. They had victims. They had a suspect. But murder cases require more than suspicion. They require evidence capable of surviving the pressure of a courtroom. Every statement must be examined. Every timeline must be reconstructed. Every forensic detail must be tested. Every contradiction becomes important. And every weakness in the prosecution's case can become an opening for the defense. This is why Homolka's cooperation was so valuable. She was not simply another witness. She was someone who had been close to Bernardo. Someone who could potentially describe what happened when no one else was watching. Someone who could potentially connect the suspect to crimes that investigators were struggling to prove. But the value of a witness can also become a danger. Because investigators must ask not only what a witness knows. They must ask why the witness is telling them. What does the witness gain? What are they hiding? What do they want investigators to believe? And what happens when the witness is also implicated? Those questions would become central to Homolka. At the time, however, Her story was powerful. She presented herself as someone who had been subjected to Bernardo's control. She described an abusive relationship. She gave investigators information. She positioned herself as someone who could help them reach the man at the center of the investigation. And investigators had to make a decision. They could pursue her as a suspect. Or they could use her cooperation to pursue Bernardo. The choice was not made in the luxury of hindsight. The tapes had not yet been discovered. The full picture was not yet visible. The prosecutors were working with the evidence they had. And that distinction is essential when examining the case honestly. Because it is easy to look backward from the discovery of the tapes and say that everything should have been obvious. It was not. Investigations do not happen with the knowledge of the future. Detectives do not know which piece of evidence is missing. Prosecutors do not know what a search tomorrow will uncover. A decision that looks shocking years later may have looked strategically reasonable at the time. That does not mean the decision cannot be criticized. It means the circumstances have to be understood. On May 14, 1993, Homolka reached an agreement with prosecutors. She would plead guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter. She would cooperate. She would testify against Bernardo. And she would receive a 12-year sentence. 12 years. Those 2 words would eventually become almost inseparable from the public memory of the case. 12 years became a symbol. To some, it represented a necessary bargain that helped prosecutors secure justice against a dangerous predator. To others, it represented a catastrophic failure of the justice system. But in May 1993, the tapes were still hidden. The prosecutors did not know everything. And the public knew even less. A publication ban meant that the courtroom did not simply become an open window into the case. The details were restricted. Information was controlled. People could hear that something terrible had happened without being allowed to know exactly what had happened. That created an atmosphere in which rumors could flourish. And when people are denied information, they often fill the empty spaces themselves. Some imagined Homolka as a frightened young woman trapped with a violent husband. Others suspected there was more to her story. But suspicion was not evidence. The public would have to wait. Then came September. September 22, 1994. A date that would become permanently attached to the case. The investigators discovered the videotapes. What happened next changed the emotional center of the investigation. Imagine an investigator realizing that a recording exists. Not a rumor. Not a second-hand account. Not an uncertain memory. A recording. Images. Evidence. The past preserved by the person who had been at the center of it. There is a strange power in recorded evidence because the passage of time cannot erase it. People can forget. People can deny. People can change their stories. But the recording remains. The tapes revealed evidence of the crimes. They also revealed something about Homolka that prosecutors had not known when they made their agreement with her. Her involvement was more active than the public had been led to believe. And that created a terrible legal problem. The prosecutors had already made the deal. Homolka had already pleaded guilty. She had already been sentenced. The new evidence could not simply be wished into existence earlier. The law had to deal with the reality that the most important evidence had arrived after the agreement. That was the moment when the case became more than a murder investigation. It became a national argument about justice. About plea bargaining. About prosecutorial discretion. About secrecy. About the relationship between evidence and punishment. And about whether a deal made in good faith could remain morally acceptable after new evidence revealed a very different picture. For the families, however, the legal debate could never capture the entire pain. Because there is no legal argument that can explain what it feels like to lose a child. There is no courtroom procedure that can make a family whole again. There is no verdict that returns a voice to someone who has been silenced. The people at the center of the story were not prosecutors. They were not detectives. They were not lawyers. They were young women. Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, Tammy Homolka, and the survivor whose identity was protected as Jane Doe. Their names must remain more important than the names of the people who harmed them. Leslie's life existed before the case. Kristen's life existed before the case. Tammy's life existed before the case. They had childhood memories. People who loved them. Small habits. Private jokes. Plans. Disappointments. Things they liked. Things they disliked. Ordinary details that never make it into police reports. That is one of the cruelest things about murder. The victim's life becomes compressed into a few lines of evidence. A date. A photograph. A location. A cause of death. A courtroom exhibit. But a human life is much larger than that. Before Leslie became a name in a murder investigation, she was a person moving through the world. Before Kristen became evidence in a criminal trial, she was a young woman with a future. Before Tammy became part of the Homolka case, she was Carla's younger sister. And before Jane Doe became a protected identity in court, she was simply a young woman who had survived something that should never have happened to her. The existence of a survivor changes the way this story must be understood. Because murder ends a life. Survival does not necessarily end the trauma. A survivor may leave the physical scene. But memory can follow. The mind can return to places that the body has escaped. Years can pass. A person can grow older. The world can move on. But certain memories do not obey the calendar. That is why the identity of Jane Doe was protected. Her privacy mattered. Her safety mattered. Her life after the crime mattered. True crime audiences sometimes want every detail. Every name. Every photograph. Every private moment. But there are moments when not knowing is an act of respect. A victim does not owe the public their pain. A survivor does not owe strangers the details of their trauma. The story can be told without turning suffering into spectacle. That principle becomes particularly important in the Bernardo case because the crimes themselves were extraordinarily disturbing. There is a temptation to describe them in graphic detail. To make the story darker. To make the audience feel closer to the horror. But the horror is already there. It does not need embellishment. The fact that these crimes happened is enough. The fact that real people suffered is enough. The fact that investigators spent years uncovering the truth is enough. The most powerful way to tell this story is not to sensationalize what happened. It is to understand how it happened. How did the victims become vulnerable? How did Bernardo avoid detection for so long? How did Homolka become involved? Why did the investigation initially misunderstand the full nature of Tammy's death? Why did prosecutors agree to the 12-year deal? Why were the tapes not discovered sooner? And perhaps most importantly, what could have been different if they had been? These questions form the spine of the story. But they cannot all be answered in the opening minutes. Because before the investigation can be understood, the world in which it happened must be understood. Ontario in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Scarborough. St. Catharines. The neighborhoods. The roads. The routines. The people. The ordinary world that existed alongside the extraordinary crimes. This is important because evil rarely announces its arrival. The morning after a crime, the sun still rises. Cars still move through intersections. Stores still open. Children still go to school. People still complain about traffic. Someone buys coffee. Someone misses a bus. Someone calls their mother. The world continues as if nothing happened. And somewhere, a family may be staring at an empty chair. That contrast between normal life and hidden terror is one of the most haunting features of true crime. The victim's world stops. Everyone else's world keeps moving. That is what happened to the families connected to this case. While they were searching for answers, other people were still going about their daily routines. While detectives were studying evidence, people were still living in the same communities where the crimes had occurred. While the investigation moved forward, the perpetrators had already left traces behind them. And some of those traces would not be recognized until much later. The investigation would eventually involve DNA, statements, searches, physical evidence, witnesses, and the videotapes. But before the breakthrough, there were years of uncertainty. Years when investigators knew a predator was operating but did not know how deep the story went. Years when families could only ask what had happened to the people they loved. Years when the full relationship between Bernardo and Homolka remained hidden. And years when the most important evidence was sitting somewhere beyond the reach of investigators. Waiting. That word is difficult to escape when looking at this case. Waiting. Leslie's family waited. Kristen's family waited. Investigators waited for evidence. Prosecutors waited for a case strong enough to survive court. The public waited for information. And the tapes waited. No one knew exactly what they contained. No one knew how dramatically they would alter the case. No one knew that they would become one of the most consequential discoveries in Canadian criminal history. Then, finally, they were found. And when investigators saw what was on them, they were forced to reconsider almost everything they believed about Karla Homolka. That is the point where the story takes another turn. Because until then, the case could still be viewed primarily through the actions of Paul Bernardo. The tapes made it impossible to ignore the other person in the room. Karla. The woman who had stood beside him. The woman who had made a deal with prosecutors. The woman who had already been sentenced. The woman whose story had been accepted, at least in part, by the justice system. Now the evidence was challenging that story. And once the challenge began, there was no way to put the old version of events back together. The public would demand explanations. Journalists would investigate. Lawyers would argue. Officials would defend decisions. Critics would attack them. And somewhere underneath all of it would remain the same question. What really happened? Not what the public had been told. Not what the media had imagined. Not what either suspect wanted people to believe. What actually happened? That question is the heart of every true crime investigation. And in this case, answering it would require looking beyond the headlines. Beyond the nickname. Beyond the photographs. Beyond the courtroom drama. It would require returning to the beginning. To the first attacks. To the first signs of a pattern. To the man who became known as the Scarborough rapist. To the woman who became his wife. To the young women whose lives intersected with theirs. And to the quiet streets where nobody looking from the outside could have known what was coming. Because before Paul Bernardo became one of Canada's most notorious criminals, he was simply a man living in Ontario. Before Karla Homolka became one of the country's most controversial convicted criminals, she was simply a young woman building a life. Before Leslie Mahaffey became a murder victim, she was simply Leslie. Before Kristen French became a name remembered in courtrooms, she was simply Kristen. Before Tammy became evidence, she was someone's daughter and someone's sister. And before Jane Doe became a protected identity, she was a young woman whose life would be permanently divided into a before and an after. That is where the story should begin. Not with monsters. With people. Because monsters belong in myths. This case belonged to the real world. And that is what makes it so difficult to forget. The roads were real. The houses were real. The families were real. The fear was real. The losses were real. And the evidence was real. Years later, when investigators looked back at the case, they would see clues that had once seemed disconnected. They would see decisions that had been made with incomplete information. They would see opportunities that had been missed. They would see evidence that arrived too late. And they would see a relationship that had concealed far more than anyone initially understood. But on the night before investigators found the tapes, none of that was visible. The world was still ordinary. People were sleeping. People were driving home. People were making plans for the next morning. And somewhere, those videotapes existed. Silent. Unseen. Waiting to expose the difference between the story people believed and the truth that had been recorded. The next chapter of this story takes us away from the courtroom and back into Ontario itself. Before the names became infamous. Before the photographs appeared on television. Before the headlines. Before the trial. We need to understand the world in which Paul Bernardo operated. The places where the attacks occurred. The atmosphere of the communities. The investigation that was already unfolding. And the young people whose lives were about to be pulled into it. Because every crime has a geography. Every predator has a pattern. Every victim has a life that existed before the crime. And every investigation begins somewhere. For this one, that place was Ontario. The year was the late 1980s. And the man who would eventually become known across Canada was still moving through the city without the world knowing his name. Not yet. But soon, people would. And when they did, they would remember a name that would become impossible to separate from the darkest questions of the case. Paul Bernardo. Ontario, Canada. The late 1980s. From a distance, there was nothing about the province that suggested a nightmare was taking shape. The streets were busy. The neighborhoods were familiar. People went to work in the morning and came home in the evening. Cars moved through intersections beneath traffic lights. Apartment buildings stood in rows. Houses filled quiet residential streets. Teenagers gathered with friends after school. Families sat down for dinner. The routines of ordinary life continued with the comforting repetition that makes people feel safe. And that sense of normality matters. Because the story of Paul Bernardo did not begin in some isolated wilderness or in a place where violence was expected. It unfolded inside communities where people believed they understood their surroundings. It unfolded among streets that looked ordinary in daylight. It unfolded in a province where people had every reason to believe that the greatest dangers in their lives would be the familiar ones: an accident on the road, a difficult winter, a lost job, an illness, a family argument. The kind of dangers people can imagine. The kind they can prepare for. But there was another danger moving through Ontario. It was harder to see. It did not announce itself. It did not arrive wearing a disguise. It lived behind an ordinary face. And for years, investigators would struggle to understand how many women had crossed paths with that face. The man was Paul Bernardo. Before he became one of Canada's most notorious convicted murderers, he was simply a young man living in Ontario. That distinction is important. Criminal histories often look inevitable when viewed backward. Once someone has been convicted of horrific crimes, people naturally search their childhood for signs. They look for a moment that explains everything. A warning. A behavior. A story. A photograph. Something that makes the later crimes seem predictable. But real life rarely offers such a clean line between childhood and criminality. People grow. People make choices. People change. And sometimes, the most important transformation happens gradually enough that the people around them do not recognize it until it is too late. Bernardo's criminal history would eventually become associated with sexual violence, murder, and extreme cruelty. But the first major public chapter of that history was not a murder investigation. It was a series of sexual assaults. Women in the Scarborough area were being attacked. The incidents were frightening precisely because the victims did not know when the danger would appear. There was no way for an ordinary person walking through a neighborhood to know that a predator might be watching. The uncertainty created its own kind of fear. When police investigate a single assault, there are many possibilities. A personal dispute. A stranger. Someone known to the victim. A random encounter. A misunderstanding. But when similar incidents continue to occur, investigators begin to ask a different question. Are these separate crimes? Or are they connected? That question changes an investigation. Suddenly, detectives are not looking at one event. They are looking for a pattern. They compare descriptions. They compare locations. They examine timelines. They look for similarities in the way victims were approached. They ask what kind of person might be capable of repeating the same behavior. And they begin to build an image of someone they have never met. The public would eventually give that unknown man a name. The Scarborough Rapist. The nickname was simple. The reality behind it was not. For the women who survived, there was no nickname. There was a person. A memory. A moment that could not be erased. And for investigators, there was a growing list of cases that needed answers. The significance of the Scarborough attacks becomes clearer when viewed against the geography of the area. Scarborough was not a single isolated community. It was part of the expanding Toronto region, a large urban environment where people were constantly moving between neighborhoods. That movement created opportunities. People entered cars. They walked along streets. They waited for transportation. They visited shopping areas. They went to work. They returned home. The city provided anonymity. Thousands of people could pass one another without ever knowing each other's names. That anonymity is part of what makes an urban predator so difficult to identify. A stranger can disappear into the crowd. A person can live only a short distance away from someone who fears him without ever being recognized. And when police do not yet know who they are looking for, every face is potentially irrelevant. Until one becomes important. Paul Bernardo's name would eventually become that face. But investigators did not begin with certainty. They began with uncertainty. That is how many major criminal investigations work. The public often imagines detectives receiving a clue that immediately points to the right person. Real investigations are slower, messier, more frustrating. They involve thousands of pieces of information, most of which lead nowhere. A witness remembers something incorrectly. A description is too vague. A potential suspect has an alibi. A piece of evidence cannot be used in court. A lead seems promising and then collapses. And while investigators are sorting through these fragments, the person they are looking for may still be living normally. That is one of the most unsettling realities of the Bernardo case. The investigation and the perpetrator were moving through the same world at the same time. Police were trying to identify the man behind the attacks. Meanwhile, Bernardo was living his life. And then there was Karla Homolka. Her presence in the story would transform the case from the search for a lone predator into something far more complicated. Karla and Paul met during a period when both were young adults. Their relationship developed into marriage. From the outside, there was nothing inherently extraordinary about that. A young couple falls in love. They spend time together. They make plans. They build a shared life. People around them may notice their personalities, their appearance, their habits. But outsiders rarely see the complete interior of a relationship. They see fragments. A couple at a restaurant. A couple at a family gathering. A couple in a photograph. A husband and wife walking together. The private world remains private. That private world would become central to the Bernardo investigation. Because the crimes were not confined to a stranger attacking women in public. The evidence eventually showed that the relationship between Bernardo and Homolka had become connected to the crimes themselves. This is where the story becomes difficult to understand. There is no single word that can explain it. Abuse describes part of the relationship. Manipulation describes part of it. Participation describes another part. And responsibility cannot simply be assigned by deciding which photograph looks more convincing. The legal system would eventually have to determine what could be proven. The public would try to determine what it believed. And historians would continue to examine the evidence. But before all of that happened, there was a family. The Homolkas. And within that family was Tammy Homolka. Tammy was Karla's younger sister. Her death in 1990 would become one of the most painful and disturbing chapters of the case. But at the time, investigators did not immediately understand it as part of a larger criminal pattern. That fact is important because it shows how fragmented the truth was. The people who knew Tammy did not possess the information that would later become available. The police did not possess it either. A death can look different depending on what you know. Without the later evidence, Tammy's death did not immediately reveal the full horror surrounding it. And so the investigation continued without one of its most important pieces. Meanwhile, the attacks associated with Bernardo continued to define his growing criminal history. Between May 1987 and December 1992, Canadian Justice Department materials state that Bernardo sexually assaulted at least 18 women and murdered 3 women. The same official account notes that authorities initially lacked admissible evidence identifying him as the perpetrator of those crimes. Those numbers are difficult to comprehend. 18 women. 3 lives lost. And for years, investigators did not have the evidence they needed to connect the crimes conclusively to the man responsible. This is where the role of forensic science becomes important. In modern true crime stories, DNA is often treated as almost magical. A sample appears. A database produces a name. The mystery is solved. But forensic science does not always work that way. Evidence must be collected properly. Samples must be analyzed. Profiles must be compared. Investigators must understand what a match means. And even a powerful forensic connection may prove one crime without automatically proving another. That distinction became critical in the Bernardo investigation. On February 1, 1993, the Center of Forensic Sciences advised police that Bernardo's DNA matched evidence from some of the sexual assaults. For investigators, this was a breakthrough. The unknown predator now had a name. The man they had been searching for was no longer an abstract figure. He was Paul Bernardo. But the DNA evidence did not, by itself, solve the murders. It connected Bernardo to sexual assaults. It did not automatically establish his responsibility for every death investigators were trying to explain. The murders required another bridge. And that bridge was Karla Homolka. This is one of the most important moments in understanding the entire case. The police had a man they could connect to sexual assaults. They had a woman who had lived closely with him. They had murders that needed to be solved. And they needed evidence that could connect the pieces. In January 1993, Homolka went to police and presented herself as a victim of spousal assault. According to Canada's Department of Justice, the investigation broke open when she came forward and implicated Bernardo. Once she did, Bernardo was arrested. That moment changed the direction of the investigation. The woman standing in front of investigators was no longer simply the wife of a suspect. She was potentially a witness. A source of information. A person who could tell them what happened when the doors were closed. But there was a complication. Homolka was not merely a witness. She was implicated in the criminal activity. That created a dilemma for the Crown. The investigators believed they had a strong case against Homolka. But according to the later Department of Justice account, they believed they did not have enough to secure Bernardo's murder convictions without her cooperation. This was the moment when the investigation became a negotiation. And negotiations in criminal cases can be uncomfortable because justice is not always a straight line. Prosecutors do not operate with unlimited evidence. They cannot simply accuse someone and expect a conviction. They have to prove their case. They have to anticipate the defense. They have to consider admissibility. They have to assess witnesses. And sometimes, they must make choices between imperfect outcomes. The decision involving Homolka would become one of the most controversial examples of that reality. But before that controversy exploded, the investigators still had to understand what they were dealing with. The public did not know. The families did not know everything. Even the authorities did not know everything. And that is perhaps the most important fact about the setting of this story. The truth was fragmented. Everyone possessed only part of it. The police had evidence. Homolka had information. Bernardo had secrets. The families had memories. The public had rumors. And somewhere in the background were recordings that had not yet been discovered. The tapes were there. The evidence existed. But investigators did not know where. That means the case was not simply a search for a killer. It was a search for the missing pieces of reality. And the more investigators learned, the more disturbing the picture would become. The setting also matters because of the era. This was before the internet had transformed everyday life. There were no smartphones. No social media feeds. No instant global communication. No cameras in every pocket. Information moved differently. A missing person report depended on traditional police work. A public warning depended on newspapers, television, radio, and word of mouth. A photograph could not be instantly distributed to millions of people with a few clicks. A rumor moved through communities more slowly. Investigators depended heavily on physical evidence and human testimony. That environment shaped the investigation. It also shaped the public's understanding. When information was restricted, people had fewer ways to challenge the official narrative. When a courtroom was closed or partially sealed, the public could not simply watch the proceedings and judge the evidence for themselves. And that would become enormously important in the Homolka case. Her trial in 1993 was conducted under extraordinary restrictions. The public was excluded from the courtroom, foreign media were excluded, and a broad publication ban limited what could be reported. Canada's Department of Justice later noted that only a narrow range of information from the proceedings could be published. To understand how strange that atmosphere was, imagine knowing that a major criminal case was unfolding in your country but being unable to hear the details. You know the names. You know the accusations are serious. You know a young woman has pleaded guilty. You know she has received 12 years. But you cannot see the evidence. You cannot hear the full testimony. You cannot know the exact circumstances surrounding the deaths. You are left with fragments. And fragments create speculation. That secrecy would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the case. But at this stage of the story, the full impact had not yet arrived. The legal system was moving forward. Homolka had information. Bernardo was facing the consequences of the investigation. And the prosecution was trying to build a case strong enough to survive trial. The families were waiting. The public was waiting. The investigators were waiting. And the missing evidence was still missing. Then came the plea agreement. On May 14, 1993, prosecutors entered into an agreement with Homolka after months of discussions with her lawyer. In exchange for her cooperation and testimony against Bernardo, she agreed to plead guilty to 2 counts of manslaughter and receive a 12-year prison sentence. She was sentenced on July 6, 1993. At the time, the decision was presented within the framework of prosecutorial necessity. The Crown believed Homolka's testimony was essential to securing Bernardo's conviction for the murders. The decision was not made with the videotapes in hand. That fact would later become crucial. Because the legal system was about to move forward on a version of the story that was incomplete. And the incomplete story had consequences. The public perception of Homolka began to form. She was the young wife. The woman who said she had suffered abuse. The woman cooperating with police. The woman testifying against Bernardo. The woman receiving 12 years. The image was powerful. But it was incomplete. The missing piece was still sitting somewhere beyond the reach of investigators. And that missing piece would not appear until more than a year later. In the meantime, Bernardo's own history was becoming clearer. He had been linked to the sexual assaults. He was now at the center of the murder investigation. The police had a suspect. The Crown had a cooperating witness. The families had the beginning of an explanation. But none of them yet had the whole truth. And the whole truth was waiting in the form of recorded evidence. The tapes would eventually reveal a surviving victim whose existence had not previously been known to investigators. They would provide evidence concerning Tammy Homolka's death. They would document crimes committed against victims. And they would fundamentally alter the understanding of Karla Homolka's role. Canada's Department of Justice later described the discovery as changing the entire complexion of the case. But that moment belongs to another chapter. For now, the story remains in the years before the discovery. Before the tapes. Before the courtroom battles. Before the public outrage. Before the country learned how much it had not known. The landscape of Ontario remained ordinary. That is what makes the contrast so haunting. A city can contain a terrible secret without changing its appearance. The same roads remain. The same houses remain. The same stores remain. The same intersections remain. The same people continue to wake up every morning. Only the meaning changes. Years later, investigators would look back and know that the danger had been there. But at the time, most people did not know. They could not know. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thought of all. A person can pass you on the street and leave no impression. You can stand next to someone in a store. You can sit near them in traffic. You can live in the same city and never realize that the person you just saw will later become the subject of national headlines. There is no soundtrack for that moment. No warning. No visual clue. Just an ordinary day. And somewhere within that ordinary day, history is being made. For Leslie Mahaffey, history would soon take a tragic form. For Kristen French, it would take another. For Tammy Homoka, the tragedy had already happened. For Jane Doe, survival would become part of the story. For their families, the world would divide into before and after. Before the disappearance. After the disappearance. Before the phone call. After the phone call. Before the police arrived. After they arrived. Before the truth. After the truth. And for investigators, the case would become a race against uncertainty. Every unanswered question mattered. Every missing piece mattered. Every contradiction mattered. Because somewhere ahead was a courtroom. And before the courtroom came the investigation. Before the verdict came the evidence. Before the evidence came the search. And before the search could truly begin, investigators needed to understand the people at the center of the story. Paul Bernardo. Carla Homoka. Tammy Homoka. Leslie Mahaffey. Kristen French. And the survivor known as Jane Doe. The next chapter will slow the story down. Not because the investigation is moving slowly, but because the victims deserve something that police reports and courtroom transcripts cannot provide. A sense of who they were before the case took them away from the ordinary lives they were living. Because if we only remember them as victims, then the crime has taken something from them twice. First, it took their lives. And then it risks reducing those lives to the circumstances of their deaths. So before we return to the nightmarish events that followed, we need to return to the people themselves. To their families. To their hopes. To the small details that made them individuals. Because Leslie Mahaffey was more than a missing person report. Kristen French was more than a murder charge. Tammy Homoka was more than a piece of evidence. And Jane Doe was more than a protected name in a court document. They were human beings living ordinary lives. And that is where the next part of this story begins. To understand what happened in Ontario during those years, it is necessary to imagine the world before the headlines. Before Paul Bernardo's face became familiar. Before newspapers filled their front pages with his name. Before the words Ken and Barbie killers entered the Canadian vocabulary. There was only a series of crimes. One after another. Each one leaving behind a frightened victim, an unsettled neighborhood, and investigators trying to determine whether they were looking at isolated incidents or something much larger. That distinction would become increasingly important. Because serial offenders do not always announce themselves as serial offenders. The first crime can look like an individual event. The second can look like coincidence. The third is when investigators begin to wonder whether coincidence is still a reasonable explanation. By then, the offender may already have learned from the earlier cases. He may understand what attracts attention. He may understand what investigators look for. He may become more careful. And the people around him may remain completely unaware. That was the environment in which Bernardo operated. The Toronto region was large enough to provide anonymity but connected enough for patterns to eventually emerge. People traveled between communities every day. Work took them from one area to another. Family obligations took them elsewhere. Shopping, entertainment, school, and social life created constant movement. A person did not need to remain in one neighborhood to become part of it. He could move through several communities without belonging completely to any of them. That mobility would matter. The crimes associated with Bernardo were not confined to a single street. Investigators eventually had to think beyond individual neighborhoods. They had to consider geography. Where did the attacks occur? Where did victims disappear? Where had Bernardo been? What roads connected these places? How long would it take to travel between them? What locations provided opportunities for someone trying to remain unseen? These are not dramatic questions. They do not sound like the kind of questions that belong in a thriller. But investigations are often built from exactly these details. Distance. Time. Traffic. Routine. Opportunity. A detective may spend hours staring at a map. A line drawn between two locations may appear meaningless. Then another line is added. Then another. Eventually, a pattern begins to emerge. The map starts telling a story. And the story points toward a person. For Bernardo, the pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Women were being attacked. Their accounts shared similarities. The police began to understand that they were not searching for an ordinary criminal. They were looking for someone who could repeat violence while maintaining enough control over his public life to avoid immediate detection. That ability to appear ordinary is one of the most disturbing aspects of many serial crimes. People expect danger to look dangerous. They expect a threatening voice, an obvious temper, a frightening appearance. But a predator does not need to look frightening. In fact, appearing ordinary can be an advantage. Ordinary people are trusted. Ordinary people are overlooked. Ordinary people can enter places without immediately attracting suspicion. And ordinary-looking people can create the illusion that there is nothing to fear. Bernardo benefited from that gap between appearance and behavior. There were people who knew him socially. People who interacted with him. People who saw the surface of his life. But the surface was not the entire story. Behind it was a pattern of behavior that investigators were slowly beginning to uncover. Then there was the question of motive. The public often wants a simple explanation. Why did he do it? Was he angry? Was he seeking power? Was he sexually motivated? Was he obsessed with control? Was there some childhood experience that supposedly explains everything? But criminal behavior rarely offers one neat answer. A forensic or psychological examination can identify patterns. It can examine personality. It can explore manipulation, aggression, entitlement, control, and other characteristics. But explaining behavior does not make it less criminal. And there is a danger in searching too desperately for an explanation. People sometimes believe that if they can understand a criminal completely, they can make the crime feel less frightening. But some actions remain frightening even after we understand the mechanisms behind them. In Bernardo's case, one of the most important mechanisms appears to have been control. Control over victims. Control within the relationship with Homolka. Control over information. Control over the narrative. And, for a time, control over what investigators knew. That last form of control would eventually collapse. But in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it was still intact. The police had suspicions. They had reports. They had victims. But suspicion is not enough. A detective cannot simply decide that someone is responsible and build the case backward. Evidence must connect the person to the crime. And the evidence must be strong enough to withstand scrutiny. This is where the victims' accounts became so important. Survivors of sexual assault often carry the burden of remembering details that occurred under extreme stress. A face. A voice. A vehicle. A location. A particular phrase. A sequence of events. Memory is not a recording. It can be affected by fear, by time, by trauma, by the desire to understand what happened. That does not make a survivor's testimony unimportant. It means investigators must treat it carefully. They compare accounts. They look for independent evidence. They ask whether different victims describe similar behavior. They examine physical evidence. They look for patterns that exist outside the memory of any one person. That process gradually strengthened the case surrounding the Scarborough attacks. But another problem remained. Even if Bernardo could be linked to sexual assaults, what connected him to the murders? This distinction would become crucial. The public might eventually see one continuous story. Investigators could not afford to. They had to separate what they knew from what they suspected. A sexual assault case required proof of one set of facts. A murder prosecution required proof of another. And the murders of Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French demanded answers that could not simply be inferred from Bernardo's previous criminal behavior. Where were they taken? What happened to them? Who was involved? What evidence remained? What did witnesses know? What could be recovered? And was Bernardo acting alone? That final question became increasingly important. Because the case contained another person. Carla Homolka. She was not a distant acquaintance. She was Bernardo's wife. She lived with him. She knew him intimately. She knew what happened inside their private life. And when she approached police, she offered information that could potentially unlock the entire investigation. But she also had something to lose. That made her position extraordinarily complicated. A cooperating witness who may also have committed crimes is not a simple witness. Every statement must be examined from multiple directions. What is true? What is exaggerated? What is omitted? What is being blamed on someone else? What does the witness admit only because the evidence already makes denial impossible? What does the witness hope to gain? And what does the witness fear? These questions were not theoretical. They were central to the decision prosecutors would soon make. Homolka's account presented Bernardo as the dominant and abusive figure. It suggested that she was living under his control. That narrative was significant because it offered prosecutors a way to understand her involvement while also gaining access to information about Bernardo. But there was a danger in accepting a suspect's account too quickly. A person involved in a crime may tell the truth. A person involved in a crime may also tell only part of the truth. Sometimes the difference is everything. The tragedy of the Bernardo Homolka investigation is that the complete picture was not available when the most consequential legal decision was made. The videotapes had not yet been found. Without them, prosecutors had to evaluate Homolka through the evidence available at the time. That evidence led to the plea agreement. But the later discovery of the tapes would demonstrate how dramatically an investigation can change when new evidence appears. The tapes did not merely add details. They changed the interpretation of the existing facts. That is a fundamental principle of criminal investigation. Evidence does not exist in isolation. Its meaning depends on context. A statement may sound convincing until another piece of evidence contradicts it. A photograph may seem harmless until investigators discover what happened immediately before it was taken. A person's behavior may seem inexplicable until the timeline is reconstructed. And a death that appears accidental may later look entirely different when viewed alongside other evidence. Tammy Homolka's death is a painful example. Tammy was not an unknown stranger. She was Carla's younger sister. She belonged to the family. Her death happened within the private world of Bernardo and Homolka. At the time, the full significance of what had happened was not understood. Later evidence would reveal that Tammy had been subjected to criminal acts by the couple before her death. The fact that her death was initially not understood as part of a larger pattern would become deeply disturbing in retrospect. Because once the later evidence emerged, investigators and the public could no longer look at the earlier events in isolation. The pieces were connected. Tammy, Leslie, Kristen, Jane Doe, the sexual assaults, Bernardo, Homolka, and the recordings. Each piece changed the meaning of the others. This is why the case cannot be told as a simple chronological list. The events happened in one order. The truth was discovered in another. That difference is crucial. Tammy died before the public understood what Bernardo and Homolka were capable of. Leslie disappeared before the full nature of their relationship was known. Kristen disappeared before investigators understood the larger pattern. Homolka made her plea agreement before the videotapes were found. And the tapes were discovered only after the public had already been given a version of Homolka that would later be challenged by evidence. The chronology of discovery therefore becomes almost as important as the chronology of the crimes. Investigators were not simply asking, "What happened?" They were asking, "When did we learn what happened?" Those are two different questions. And the second one explains why the case became so controversial. Because justice depends not only on what happened, but on what can be proven. That is where the law enters the story. A prosecutor may believe a person committed a crime. A police officer may believe it. A family may know in their heart. The public may be convinced. But a criminal conviction requires evidence that satisfies the legal standard. That is why prosecutors sometimes make plea agreements. They must calculate the strength of their case. They must consider what witnesses will say. They must consider whether evidence will be admitted. They must anticipate challenges from the defense. They must think about what happens if a case goes to trial and the jury does not accept their theory. From the outside, this can look cold. A family may hear that someone who participated in a terrible crime is receiving a deal and wonder how such a thing can be fair. But the justice system does not operate on emotion alone. At the same time, justice cannot ignore morality. That tension would become one of the defining features of the Homolka plea agreement. The Crown believed cooperation was necessary. The public later believed the price was too low. Both positions cannot be understood without examining the evidence available at the time. And that is precisely why the discovery of the tapes was so explosive. The tapes represented information that the prosecution did not possess when it made the deal. They effectively changed the evidence landscape after the legal decision had already been made. The consequences were enormous. But before that storm arrived, there was another important reality. The public was becoming increasingly interested in the case. The murders of two young women had already created fear. The sexual assault investigation surrounding Bernardo added another layer. The relationship between Bernardo and Homolka created another. And the secrecy surrounding the proceedings made everything more mysterious. When information disappears behind a publication ban, curiosity does not disappear with it. Sometimes it grows. People began asking questions. Why was Homolka receiving 12 years? What exactly had happened to the victims? How much did she know? How much had she done? Why was so much information being withheld? The absence of answers created a vacuum. And into that vacuum came speculation. Some speculation was reasonable. Some was not. This is another important part of the setting. True crime cases do not exist only inside police stations and courtrooms. They exist inside the public imagination. A case becomes a story. The story becomes a narrative. The narrative becomes an image. And sometimes the image becomes more powerful than the evidence. That happened here. Bernardo became the predator. Homolka became the mysterious wife. The nickname Ken and Barbie killers turned the couple into a grotesque cultural symbol. But nicknames have a dangerous effect. They simplify. They make real people feel like characters. And once a criminal case becomes a kind of mythology, the victims can disappear beneath the mythology. That is why this story must continually return to the people who were harmed. The geography of the case is important. The police work is important. The legal decisions are important, but none of them should eclipse the human beings at the center. Leslie Mahaffey had a life. Kristen French had a life. Tammy Homoka had a life. Jane Doe survived. Their stories existed independently of the people who later became infamous. The crimes interrupted those lives. They did not define the people who lived them. That distinction matters especially when telling a case decades later. Time creates distance. The people who were young in the early 1990s are now older. Some witnesses have died. Some investigators have retired. Some memories have faded. The communities have changed. Buildings may have changed. Roads may look different. Technology has transformed. The way police investigate crimes has transformed. DNA databases have expanded. Digital evidence has become central to modern investigations. But the basic questions remain. What happened? Who was responsible? What did investigators know? When did they know it? What could they prove? And did the punishment reflect the true level of responsibility? The Bernardo case remains significant because those questions do not belong only to the 1990s. They belong to every criminal justice system. How should prosecutors handle a cooperating offender? How much secrecy is justified in protecting an investigation? How should the rights of victims be balanced against the rights of defendants? What happens when evidence emerges after a plea agreement? How should the public understand a case when critical information cannot legally be published? These are not merely questions about one infamous couple. They are questions about how society responds to extreme crime. But before those questions can be answered, the story has to return to the people who were living through it. The families. The investigators. The survivors. The victims. And the two people whose relationship would become the center of one of Canada's most notorious criminal cases. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homoka. Their story did not exist in a vacuum. It grew within ordinary communities. That is perhaps the most frightening lesson of the setting. There was no special border separating the safe world from the dangerous one. There was no visible line on the pavement. No neighborhood sign that said violence begins here. The same roads could carry someone home from work and carry a predator toward his next victim. The same suburban landscape could contain a family preparing dinner and a criminal planning an attack. The same evening sky could hang over a peaceful neighborhood while somewhere else a young woman was fighting for her life. The landscape remained indifferent. That is what landscapes do. They do not know what happened on them. They do not remember. People remember. Families remember. Investigators record. Courts preserve evidence. And years later, storytellers try to reconstruct the past. But the streets themselves remain silent. That silence can be misleading. A quiet neighborhood does not necessarily mean nothing happened there. A clean house does not necessarily mean nothing terrible happened inside. A smiling photograph does not necessarily mean a happy relationship. And an apparently ordinary couple does not necessarily have an ordinary private life. The Bernardo investigation would force Canada to confront all of these assumptions. The country would eventually learn that the person responsible for a long series of sexual assaults had been living among them. It would learn that the woman beside him had played a far more complicated role than many initially believed. It would learn that young women had suffered terribly. It would learn that evidence capable of transforming the case had existed before investigators found it. And it would learn that the justice system, like every human institution, operates with incomplete information. Sometimes the truth is not hidden because someone deliberately covers it. Sometimes it is hidden because no one knows where to look. Until one day, they do. The videotapes were waiting. But before investigators found them, another chapter had already been written. The murders had happened. The plea agreement had been signed. Homoka had been sentenced. Bernardo was heading toward trial. And the public was still missing the most important part of the story. That missing part would eventually arrive in the form of evidence that could no longer be explained away as rumor. But to understand why that discovery was so devastating, we first have to understand the people whose lives had been torn apart. Not as names in a legal document. Not as photographs in a newspaper. Not as characters in a true crime story. As people. People who woke up in the morning. People who had families. People who had plans. People who expected to see another day. The next part of the story belongs to them. Leslie Mahaffey. Kristen French. Tammy Homoka. And the survivor known only as Jane Doe. Their lives existed before Paul Bernardo's name became infamous. And for a moment, before the investigation takes us deeper into darkness, that is where we should look. Before a criminal case becomes history, it is first a collection of ordinary days. That is something easily forgotten. Decades later, people remember dates. They remember courtroom photographs. They remember police statements. They remember headlines. They remember the names of suspects and the sentences handed down by judges. But the people who lived through those years did not experience them as chapters in a book. They experienced them one day at a time. A morning. An afternoon. An evening. Another morning. The future still looked open. That is how life works. Most people do not wake up knowing that a particular day will become the last ordinary day they ever experience. They do not know that a routine drive will later become part of a police timeline. They do not know that a family photograph will someday be displayed because investigators need the public to recognize a missing person. They do not know that a name written casually in a notebook will later appear in court documents. The people connected to this case did not know either. Ontario continued moving. The province was changing, growing, modernizing. Toronto,